Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week brings us two very different guests who nonetheless make you say, you can't make that up. In the second half of our show, New York Post columnist Naomi Schaefer-Riley walks us through what she calls scenes from the feminist implosion. Up first, we have Bob McNamara from the Institute for Justice, bringing us up to date on his fight with the powers that be in Atlantic City, determined to bulldoze private homes for the benefit of unnamed gambling interests. Bob, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Bob, you're involved in a number of eminent domain cases. It would probably help to take us back to defining what eminent domain is and how it's been used in American history.
Sure. Eminent domain is the government's traditional power to forcibly acquire private property for public use. So if the government wants to build a road or a canal or a school, it has the power, and has always had the power since the founding, to force private property owners to sell their property to the government at market rates, and for the government to then put that property to a public use.
So the government needs to be the buyer.
Exactly. The government acquires the property and then uses it on behalf of the public. Typically, the courts have called it the despotic power. It's an extreme power to strip someone of their private property rights. But the justification was for certain public uses, for roads and the like, there's no other way for the government to actually accomplish its ends. And you can believe that or you cannot believe that. But that's not actually the outrageous part of eminent domain in this country.
But it is supported in the Constitution. The Constitution makes provision for this.
Absolutely. The Constitution recognizes the traditional power of eminent domain. Legally speaking, there's always been a power of eminent domain. Whether or not you can justify it morally is something people can argue about. But where things have really gone off the rails, so to speak, is in the court's policing of what it means to be a public use. Far from seeing eminent domain used to build roads or schools or canals, what we now see eminent domain used for is literally taking property from one private owner and then handing that property over to another private owner whom the government simply likes better.
And when did this start?
This started in the 1950s. There was a mania in the country for what was called blight clearance. And blight basically means a neighborhood that isn't quite as nice as the government would like that neighborhood to be. And blight, anyone who has a garden knows exactly what you do with blight. You tear it out root and branch. And so what the government started doing in the 1950s was saying, this area of the city isn't as fancy as we would like it. It's not as nice as we would like it. And they would seize huge swaths of property through eminent domain, bring in bulldozers, and knock everything down in the hopes of then building something better.
So this was the urban redevelopment movement. Robert Moses in New York was involved with that. Sometimes they called it slum clearance. Was that really all part of this?
Exactly. It's all part of the same narrative of kind of central planners thinking that the real problem with the city, the real problem with this neighborhood are the buildings and the people who live there. And if we can just get rid of them and replace it with something we draw up in our boardroom, then everything will get better and then everyone will be rich.
Well, how did that all work out?
It worked out about as well as central planning tends to work out. There are neighborhoods in this country that still haven't recovered.
I grew up in New York, and I remember this. There are some really awful parts of town built for public housing that used to be thriving communities.
And, the people who were in those communities actually never recover. There is a great book by a professor named Mindy Fullilove called Root Shock that tracks the actual physical effects of being displaced from your neighborhood and displaced from your community. And it's no exaggeration to say that it kills people. People die significantly earlier if they are uprooted from their support network and their neighborhood and their neighbors. And that's what this so-called slum clearance was doing. They're not just getting rid of the neighborhood, they're getting rid of the neighbors. They're getting rid of the human beings who live here.
And the eyes on the street. I remember Jane Jacobs had written about this extensively in New York City, trying to finally stop the Robert Moses bulldozers.
Exactly. When you have people who live in the neighborhood, they take care of each other, they watch each other's kids, and, not for nothing, but they recognize when someone's breaking into your house or doing something they shouldn't be doing. So
this started in the 50s. Did it ever abate, or did it just sort of continue growing from there?
There have been a couple big waves of eminent domain abuse in this country. You had the wave of sort of Robert Moses-style, 1950s-style redevelopment, and that didn't work. It was catastrophic. And people started to recognize that, and you saw fewer of these full neighborhood clearing projects like you saw with Robert Moses or with Pole Town in Detroit. And then you saw another wave pick up in the 1990s where people started doing things like this again. And that's about where IJ comes onto the scene. In the late 1990s, we started litigating eminent domain cases. And in all honesty, when we started doing eminent domain work, we were told by property rights lawyers that we shouldn't bother. We were told that...
Why?
Well, since the 1950s, the courts had basically left the field. They had stopped enforcing public use limitations. And what everyone told us when we started was, look, you just don't litigate about the government's right to take property anymore. That's settled in this country. All you can do is fight about how much the government has to pay for property. The government can take anything they want for any reason. And that didn't seem right to us. That struck us as not just wrong, but un-American and unconstitutional. And so we started systematically and strategically fighting back.
And how did the Institute for Justice do in those early cases?
We did shockingly well. Our first eminent domain case, we represented a woman named Vera Koking, who was an elderly woman who lived in a house in Atlantic City, and a state agency wanted to take her home to turn it over to Donald Trump so that Donald Trump could build a limousine parking lot. And this is a lesson, I think, in the value of selecting cases that have good facts. Because it's not just a parking lot, it's a limousine parking lot.
A limo and it's Donald Trump.
And it's Donald Trump. And that was our first eminent domain case and our first eminent domain victory. We defeated the land grab. Vera stayed in her house, actually, until this year. Her house was finally sold. She's older and has moved into a nursing home. But it was our first case, and once we litigated Vera's case, we started getting calls from all over the country. Obviously, when Donald Trump is involved, you get a lot of media attention, and people started reading about the case in the newspaper, and we got all these phone calls that, oh, hey, that's happening to me, that's happening to my cousin, that's happening in my neighborhood. And we discovered there was really this rising wave of eminent domain abuse that my colleague Dana Berliner documented in a book called Public Power, Private Gain, where she found 10,000 properties nationwide over a 5-year period that were being threatened with eminent domain for private development, not for roads or schools, but for luxury condos and shopping malls.
Shopping malls. And you took this all the way to the Supreme Court with a now famous case called Kelo. Can you fill us in on that?
So what happened in Kelo v. New London is an organization called the New London Development Corporation, which is a quasi-governmental organization, wanted to clear-cut this historic area near the Long Island Sound called the Fort Trumbull neighborhood. And Fort Trumbull was a lot of older houses. It was small houses, but it was small houses with spectacular views. And so the people who lived there loved them.
Blue-collar, well-kept. This was not a slum.
No. These were lovely older homes occupied by people who had either acquired them as their dream home or who were literally living in the house where they were born, living in houses that had been in their families for generations. And the view of the New London Development Corporation was basically that views like this shouldn't belong to people like that, and that instead this land should be given over to luxury condos that could be occupied by rich people.
And what happened?
We litigated the case all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and the government's position in this case was that the public use in this case was that if they built nicer things on this land, richer people would move in, and those richer people would pay higher taxes, and higher tax revenue is a public use. That was actually their logical syllogism. And I distinctly remember Justice O'Connor asked the lawyer representing New London, well, wait a minute, doesn't your argument mean that you could just take any hotel, you could take a Motel 6 and replace it with a Hilton just because the Hilton's more expensive? And the lawyer for New London said, yes. Not yes, but, not
just yes.
Maybe, just yes, we absolutely can do that.
And how did the Supreme Court rule?
Astoundingly, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court signed on to exactly that proposition.
Wow.
That public use literally means taking from poorer people to give to richer people. It's Robin Hood in reverse, that as long as you're handing it over to someone you think will pay higher taxes, that's public use enough to justify the use of eminent domain under the federal Constitution. So
that's now the law of the land.
Well, that's the law of the land, at least as the U.S. Constitution goes, until the Supreme Court overrules Kelo, which, is a goal we're constantly working towards. It's not the law of the land in all 50 states. Wherever you live, there are 2 constitutions that restrict the government. There's the federal Constitution that provides individual rights protection, but every state has its own constitution. Every state has its own laws that limit what government agents are going to be allowed to do.
So how do the states react to Kelo?
They reacted exactly as you would hope. Kelo is, without question, the most reviled Supreme Court decision of my lifetime. And 44 states have responded to the Kelo ruling by adopting laws that make it harder to do this kind of eminent domain abuse, to make it harder to take property from one person just to give it to another. Those laws have varying strength, but there's been an enormous backlash. There are a couple of holdouts, New York State probably the worst among them. In the wake of Kelo, I think New York proposed a bill that would create a committee that would study the possibility of someday reforming eminent domain, and that didn't pass.
Wow.
But outside of the holdouts, there was really a massive backlash against this kind of land grab, and we were very successful in beating back the wave of eminent domain abuse until recently. Really, in just the past year or so, we have started to see the tide of eminent domain abuse ticking up again around the country as land-hungry bureaucrats and their developer cronies seem to think that maybe people aren't watching anymore, that maybe the country was outraged for 10 years, but maybe things have slowed down. And so we're starting to see eminent domain rear its head again in place after place, and we're gearing up to have this fight again.
So before we head back to Atlantic City, what happened in New London? At the end of the day, they bulldozed those homes, and then what?
Well, they bulldozed almost all the homes. One home that belonged to Suzette Kelo, who was our lead plaintiff, who lived in a little pink house that kind of became the symbol of the whole fight. IJ actually raised money, and we put her house up on a truck, and we moved it across town, and we put it on a new foundation as a monument to eminent domain abuse. So we did that, and in the meantime, the New London Development Corporation has failed utterly to deliver on any of its promises of development. The Fort Trumbull neighborhood is now a brownfield. It's full of feral cats and wild birds and weeds. They've built exactly nothing in the years since the Kelo decision came down, which I always like to say means that the Institute for Justice has engaged in more construction in New London, Connecticut than the New London Development Corporation has, and we didn't even need to steal anything to do it.
Good. So you're back in Atlantic City. It's yet again the same story or a very similar story to it was last time when you went up against Donald Trump. What's the story now?
In ways, it's even worse, though once again we're representing an elderly citizen in a fight against the same state agency. New Jersey has this state agency called the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's a state agency that's designed to funnel tax dollars to casinos and casino-related development. But to make matters worse, it has the power of eminent domain, which it uses pretty indiscriminately. And the guy at the center of this fight is Charlie Birnbaum. And Charlie's like a character out of a movie, to be honest. His parents are Holocaust survivors. They met while hiding in the woods of Poland from the Nazis during World War II.
Oh, geez.
And after the war, they moved to the United States, and they ended up in Atlantic City, where they bought this little row home just a couple blocks off the water. And Charlie grew up there, always being told by his parents that the great thing about this country was the ability to have your own space, the ability to have a place where nobody could come in and boss you around and tell you what to do. And as Charlie got older, the other thing about Charlie is that he is legitimately a genius. Charlie is a piano virtuoso. He soloed with the Philadelphia Philharmonic when he was 17. He is the best musician I've ever met. But when he hit his early 20s, he realized he hated performing. He hated the anxiety. He hated being in front of the crowds. And what he ended up doing is instead of playing pianos for a living, he tunes pianos for a living. He has his parents' house in the center of Atlantic City.
Has a little trade.
He's the piano tuner for all the casinos. He's tuned for everyone. He's tuned for Frank Sinatra. He has on the first floor of the home. It's a shrine to kind of two things. It's a bunch of memorabilia of Charlie's parents who spent their lives in the home and loved the home. And he has pictures of him as a teenager tarring the roof with his dad. And then he has pictures from just a couple of years ago in almost the same place of Charlie with his son-in-law maintaining the house. And so it's memories of his parents with memories of his musical career and memorabilia from Sinatra. And it's really his entire life, and it's the only thing that lets him keep his piano tuning business going on.
And what is the Casino Redevelopment Authority trying to do?
Well, they're trying to take his property through eminent domain, but I guess they've learned their lesson about taking things for limousine parking lots, because what they're actually doing is taking it for nothing.
No, you're making that up.
No, their plan actually is they're going to take Charlie's home, they're going to take some nearby property, they're going to knock everything down, and then they're going to think really hard about what should maybe go there instead. They have no idea what they're going to build. They might build another townhouse, they might build a restaurant, they might wait for a private developer to come along who they can give the land to. They have no idea. All they know is that they would rather the land be vacant and theirs rather than useful and Charlie's.
Well, this must be because Atlantic City's booming and the casinos are doing so well, right?
When they adopted the resolution to take these properties 2 years ago, Charlie is just a couple blocks from what at that point was the brand new Revel Casino.
Mm-hmm.
And in their resolution, they said we should take a bunch of land so that we can encourage development that will complement the Revel Casino and assist with the demands we expect to be created by a successful resort business.
So that was the master plan.
That was the master plan, which has, as master plans tend to do, which has ended in just absolute shambles.
Well, what's going on?
Well, the Revel Casino opened 2 years ago. It has entered bankruptcy twice in those 2 years. And the most recent development is that this ornate building that was built at a cost of about $2.4 billion went up for bankruptcy auction and attracted no qualified bidders. No one wants to buy the $2.4 billion building at any price.
But they're trying to create an empty lot next to it because that's going to be valuable.
Exactly. That's what really needs to happen is the Revel is actually closing in September. They've announced they're closing their doors. They're laying off all their employees. But for whatever reason, that's not stopping the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority. Because what they say now their plan is they used to want to create development that would complement the successful Revel Casino. Now they need to do exactly the same thing to encourage development that will make up for the fact that the Revel Casino is closed.
Bob, you can't make this up, right?
It's amazing. It's almost pathological. It doesn't matter what the facts on the ground are. The only reasonable solution they can come up with is to destroy Charlie's home. If the Revel's successful, they need to destroy Charlie's home. If the Revel's closing, they need to destroy Charlie's home. If space aliens invade, they probably need to destroy Charlie's home. It's almost unbelievable, except for the fact that it's happening, and it's happening to a real person.
Now, all their legal bills are being paid for by taxpayers?
It's all being paid for with government money, with money that comes from the Casino Reinvestment Development Authority that could be spent on actual public good instead of paying lawyers to fight with me about exactly how poorly they can treat this son of Holocaust survivors.
And what's the status of the case?
The case is still ongoing. We're just a couple weeks away from being back in court, telling the judge that property rights exist, even in New Jersey, telling the judge that this is just an astonishing claim of power by a government agency, that not even the Kelo argument of the government saying we can take a Motel 6 and replace it with a Hilton. This is a step beyond that. This is saying we can take the Motel 6, we can take anything. We can take your house and your mother's house just because we want it. We'll come up with the reason afterwards, and how dare you ask us why?
And so that makes it pretty unique. That's the first of its kind?
It is the most astonishing claim of government power I have encountered in my time at the Institute for Justice. They're literally saying we can take any land, anywhere, for any reason, and absolutely no one has the right to stop us.
And I don't know how you did in the judge lottery, but does this judge's past give any indication of how he might rule?
We're in front of a very experienced judge. I've appeared in front of him in this case once before. He's reading the briefs carefully. He's very engaged, and I have every confidence that he is going to do the right thing and refuse to give the government a blank check to seize anything they want.
So, Bob, given the facts of the matter, given the recent aggressiveness of local governments, do you think there's a reawakening that's going on in the country about eminent domain abuse?
There is definitely a reawakening going on in the country about eminent domain abuse. There were several years when eminent domain abuse was exactly what it should be, which is politically toxic and impossible to get off the ground. And people seem to be forgetting the lessons of Kelo. They seem to be forgetting the lessons of both what happens when you let the government have unchecked power to seize property. You end up with empty fields and wasted millions of dollars. But they're also forgetting the legal lessons, and I think that's actually the area where we can be of most use, because one of the biggest lessons of the last wave of eminent domain abuse is that if you abuse eminent domain, the Institute for Justice shows up, and we make your life miserable. And that is, frankly, something that people seem to be forgetting, and something they're going to have to be reminded of.
So, Bob, what is IJ's broader portfolio? You do more than eminent domain abuse, don't you?
We do. We are the National Law Firm for Liberty. We litigate in state and federal courts across the country defending educational choice, private property rights, free speech, and economic liberty. And in each of these areas, we are arguing for a vision of the rule of law under which individuals can control their own destinies as free and responsible members of society. And we're advancing that through a vision of judicial engagement, that judges need to look at actual facts, and judges need to really look at the rights that are at stake in every case that comes before them. And we're doing our best to preserve the individual rights of everyone to educate their children, to start a business, to speak out about politics or about business, and to own their property without having it unjustly taken away from them by government agents.
So basically an ACLU who believes in the Constitution and private property.
I think that's a very good description. We've definitely been called the Libertarian ACLU, and that's a label I will wear with pride.
And how can people learn more?
Our website is www.ij.org, where you can find more information about Charlie Birnbaum and more information about all of our cases.
Bob, thanks so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
That was Bob McNamara, Senior Attorney with the Institute for Justice, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please send me your comments and feedback on this or any of our past shows. Just visit realclearradio.org and click on the email Bill link. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, one of America's top political websites. For the latest news articles, election polls, and political commentary, I visit realclearpolitics.com every morning. Ahead, New York Post columnist Naomi Schaefer-Riley explores whether political correctness can get any more complicated by delving into the latest twists and turns of academic feminism's rejection of the transgender. Stay tuned.